My mother-in-law ordered a DNA test to prove my daughter wasn't my husband's child. Not suggested one. Not raised the possibility in a private conversation with her son. Ordered one. Purchased it. Cuteling. Mailed it to our house in a padded envelope with a note that said, in her handwriting, for the sake of everyone's clarity. She had addressed it to my husband. She had not told me it was coming. She had, apparently, been planning it for long enough to research the brand, select the kit, and compose a note she considered sufficiently neutral to be unobjectionable. It was not neutral. There is no neutral version of telling your son, through the mechanism of a commercial DNA kit, that you believe his wife has been unfaithful. My daughter was 14 months old. She was, at the time the envelope arrived, asleep in the next room in the particular boneless way of toddlers, completely, trustingly, with her small fist curled under her chin. I had just put her down, Gita. I was standing in the kitchen when my husband brought me the envelope and showed me the note. I read it twice. I said, "She thinks I cheated." He said, "I know." I said, "Did you ask her to do this?" He looked at me and said, "No." And I believed him, because I know my husband, and because the expression on his face was not guilt, but the particular devastation of a man who has just watched his mother do something he cannot undo. I said, "Ibn, what are you going to do?" He said, "I'm going to send it back." I said, "No." He looked at me. I said, "We're going to take the test, and then we're going to deal with whatever it shows." I said it with a steadiness I did not entirely feel, because I am a person who has learned that steadiness, in the moment of someone else's aggression, is the most effective response available. I was also steady because I had nothing to hide. I knew who my daughter's father was. I knew it with the complete certainty of a woman who had been entirely faithful to her husband for 11 years, and who had nothing to fear from a cotton swab in a plastic tube. What I did not know, what none of us knew, was that the test would return a result that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with her. Stay with me. This story goes somewhere none of us saw coming, and I want to tell it exactly as it happened, because the truth of it is more complete than anything I could have constructed. Subscribe if you're new. And if you have ever been accused of something by someone who was guilty of the same thing, this one is for you. My name is Sarah. I am 39 years old. I am a corporate litigator at a firm in Boston, which means I spend my professional life in the architecture of conflict, finding the truth in contested situations, building cases from evidence, learning to distinguish between what people claim and what the record actually shows. I am precise, and I am patient, and I do not make accusations without documentation. I want you to hold that last part. I grew up in Western Massachusetts, the daughter of a high school librarian and a civil engineer. In a household where disagreement was managed with words and evidence, and the general assumption that most problems could be resolved if everyone was honest about the relevant facts. I carried this assumption into my marriage and my career and my relationship with my in-laws, and it served me well in the first two of those contexts, and failed me comprehensively in the third. My husband's name is David. He is a cardiologist, a man of genuine warmth and diagnostic precision, which sounds like a contradiction and is instead a description of the specific kind of person who is drawn to a field that requires both. We met in our late 20s, married at 32, and spent 3 years trying to have a child before our daughter Nora arrived 14 months before the envelope. Nora has David's eyes, Evie. She has always had David's eyes, the particular gray-green that his family calls the Hendrix color, hue. Documented in 3 generations of photographs I have seen, and that his mother has seen and that his mother nonetheless decided, for reasons I will get to, required laboratory confirmation. Her name is Margaret, my mother-in-law. She is 67 years old, and she is a woman of strong opinions held with the conviction of someone who has rarely been required to defend them against evidence. She is the kind of mother-in-law who arrives at your house, unannounced, and reorganizes your kitchen while you are at work, and describes this as helpfulness. Either. She is the kind of woman who tells you how to raise your child while implying that your instincts are insufficient, and your background is the explanation. She has never, in 11 years, Ibni, said my name without a slight pause before it, as if she is confirming, each time, that I am still the person she thought I was. She never thought I was the right person. I knew this from the first Thanksgiving, Eva. I know it still. And I had made a separate peace with it. The peace of a litigator who has learned that not every adversarial relationship requires active engagement. I managed her. I maintained the relationship, I was present at the family events and cordial in the phone calls, and I did not take her bait when she offered it, which she offered regularly and with the practiced casualness of a woman who has spent decades refining the technique. The DNA kit was not bait. The DNA kit was an escalation. I need to tell you the history, because the envelope did not arrive without a history. When I became pregnant, Margaret's first response was not congratulations. Her first response was a question about the timing. Had we been trying long? She asked, with an emphasis on the word trying that I catalogued, and did not respond to directly. When Nora was born and people began noting the Hendricks eyes, Margaret was notably quiet in those conversations, present but not participating, the silence of a woman not yet persuaded. In the months that followed, she made comments, not accusations. She was too practiced for direct accusations. But comments, offered with the plausible deniability of someone who can always claim she meant something else. She said once, when Nora was 6 months old, that babies could look like anyone in the early months, and that features settled later. She said, at 8 months, that coloring could be inherited from grandparents in unexpected ways. She said, at 11 months, that she had read an interesting article about the limitations of physical resemblance as a genetic indicator. I documented all of it. I am a litigator. I document. David addressed each comment as it arose, with more patience than I would have deployed in his position. He told her she was out of line. She told him he was sensitive. He told her the comments were hurtful to me. She told him she was simply thinking out loud. This is the specific grammar of a woman who has operated this way for decades. The comment, the injury, the denial of intent, the repositioning of the response as the problem. The DNA kit arrived when Nora was 14 months old. It was, I understood when I saw it, the culmination of a year of preparation. Margaret had been building to this. The comments had been reconnaissance. The envelope was the filing. David wanted to return the kit unopened. I understood the impulse. It was the impulse of a man who wanted to refuse the premise of the accusation, who did not want to dignify the suggestion with a response, who believed that taking the test meant accepting, on some level, that the question was legitimate. I overruled him. Not because I wanted to prove anything to Margaret. I did not need to prove anything to Margaret. But because I am a litigator, and I understand what happens when you refuse to produce evidence in a dispute where the other side has already formed a conclusion. Refusing the test would not resolve Margaret's suspicion, it would confirm it, and Margaret would carry that confirmation. And it would shape her relationship with Nora, and Nora would grow up in the presence of a grandmother whose doubt had been allowed to stand unanswered. I would not allow it to stand unanswered. We took the test. David and Nora as directed. We sent it back. We waited 3 weeks. The results arrived on a Tuesday morning. I was at the office. David called me at 9:15, and I stepped into a conference room and closed the door. He said, the results came. I said, and? He said, Nora is mine. 99.9%. She's mine. I said, I know. He said, Sarah. Something in his voice, I said. What? He said, there's something else. The kit, the way these tests work, they identify genetic markers. And there were markers in my profile that. He stopped. I waited, he said. The markers suggest a half-sibling relationship with an unidentified individual. It flagged it because these services connect to databases. Someone in the database shares enough markers with me to indicate we share one biological parent. I understood immediately what this meant. I am a litigator. I connect evidence to conclusions without delay. I said, "Who?" He said, "I don't know yet. The database shows the match but not the name." "But Sarah, the match is on my father's side. The markers are paternal." His father had been dead for 9 years. His father, Gerald Hendricks, Yurisam, who had been married to Margaret for 38 years, who had been a quiet and decent man by every account I had ever encountered, who had died of pancreatic cancer in a hospice bed with Margaret holding his hand, who existed in the family mythology. As a fixed and uncomplicated point, I said, "Have you told your mother?" He said, "Not yet." I said, "Don't. Not until we know more." Giba, I want to tell you what it felt like to be in that conference room, because the feeling was not what you might expect. It was not triumph. I want to be clear about that. I had been accused, implicitly and then explicitly, of infidelity by a woman who had spent 14 months constructing a case against my fidelity while living with a secret about her own marriage's fidelity. The irony was total and available, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt the specific sorrow of a person watching a complicated thing become more complicated. I felt grief for David, who had loved his father without reservation, who was now holding a result that suggested his father had been someone he had not fully known. I felt the strange vertigo of a story that had been about me, turning out to have always been about someone else, me. And underneath all of that, I felt the cold clarity of someone who has just found the key piece of evidence in a case. I went back to my desk. I did not tell anyone. I opened my laptop and I began to research. The DNA database that had flagged the half-sibling match was a consumer genealogy service. With David's permission, he gave it within an hour, without hesitation, which is one of the many reasons I married him. I accessed his account and examined the match. The match had a username but no public profile. The shared centimorgans, the unit of genetic measurement that indicates the degree of relationship, suggested a half-sibling or half-aunt-uncle relationship with high confidence. The match had uploaded their DNA 3 years ago and had not logged in since. I am a litigator. I know how to find people. It took me 4 days. I will not detail the process. Some of it involved professional resources I have access to through my firm, and the specific methodology is less important than the result. What matters is that on Friday afternoon I had a name. A woman named Patricia Olan, 59 years old. Living in Connecticut. A retired teacher, divorced, 2 adult children. I ran the genealogy backward from the match data. The genetic markers placed her biological father in the same generation as Gerald Hendricks. The geographic overlap. Patricia had grown up in the same Connecticut county where Gerald had lived before marrying Margaret. Was consistent. I called a genealogist I have worked with professionally. I gave her the data. She confirmed angiolysis within 24 hours. The most probable explanation for the match was that Patricia Olin was the biological daughter of Gerald Hendricks, conceived during a period prior to or during his marriage to Margaret. Gerald Hendricks had a daughter that Margaret had not produced. David and I sat with this information for a week before we decided what to do with it. This is the part of the story I want to tell carefully, because it would be easy, and it would be understandable, to describe what followed as retribution, as the satisfying completion of a circle that Margaret had drawn. She had tried to prove my daughter wasn't David's. The test had proven, instead, that her husband had a child she hadn't known about. The irony was complete and available, and I am not going to pretend it was lost on me. But David had just learned that his father was not entirely the person he had known. That is a specific grief that has nothing to do with Margaret's behavior. And I wanted to be in that grief with him before anything else happened. We talked for many hours that week, about his father, about what he knew and what he was revising, about the specific complexity of grieving someone you loved, and simultaneously learning something that requires you to hold them differently. He said, at one point, I'm not angry at him. I don't know why I'm not angrier. I said, because you loved him. And love doesn't disappear because the picture gets more complicated. He said, I want to reach out to her, to Patricia. I said, I know. He said, is that okay? I said, Ease. She's your sister. Of course it's okay. He reached out to Patricia Olin by letter. He wrote it himself, without my input, which was right. This was his family and his history and his letter to write. Yeep. He introduced himself, explained the DNA match, told her he was not looking for anything from her except the chance to know if she wanted to know him. She responded within a week. She had known Ian. Not since birth. She had been raised by her mother and a stepfather, and had been told her biological father's identity only when she was in her 30s, after her mother's death. Ian. In a letter her mother had left, with an attorney for posthumous delivery. She had known Gerald Hendricks's name for nearly 30 years. She had known he was married. She had chosen not to make contact because she had not wanted to disrupt a family she had no relationship with. She had uploaded her DNA to the genealogy service 3 years ago, she told David, because she was curious about her medical history, and not because she was searching for family. She had not known, when she uploaded it, that it would find anyone. She and David have spoken 4 times since the letter. I have not been part of those conversations. They are his to have. What I know is that he comes away from them quieter and more settled simultaneously. Which is the specific texture of adding something to a life that was complete, and finding it becomes more complete. He has a sister, routine. She is 59 and lives in Connecticut, and taught 3rd grade for 30 years, and has 2 children who are now David's niece and nephew by a biological logic that none of them designed. Life, I have found, does not stay the shape you made it, Margaret. I have told you about the envelope and the note, and the year of comments and the DNA kit that returned a result she had not anticipated. Fen. I have not yet told you about the conversation, which happened 6 weeks after the results, in David's parents' house. The house where he grew up, where his father's photographs still line the hallway, where Margaret has lived alone for 9 years surrounded by the fixed and uncomplicated mythology of her marriage. David told her. Not me, him, This was his conversation to have, and I did not attend it, and did not ask for a report until he was ready to give one. What I know is that he was there for 3 hours, and that he drove home afterward and came inside and sat on the couch without taking off his coat for a long time. I sat next to him. I did not ask. I waited, said, she knew what? He said, not everything. She didn't know Patricia's name or where she was. But she knew there had been someone. She found a letter, years ago, between. Before my father died. And she confronted him, and he admitted there had been someone before they married, and that the someone had become pregnant, and that he had lost contact, and didn't know what had happened. I said, before they married. He said that's what he told her. That it was before, that he had found out about the pregnancy after they were together, and had ended the other relationship, and didn't know if the child had been born. I said, did she believe him? He was quiet for a moment. Then, she chose to believe him. She said she chose to believe him because the alternative was losing everything she had built. I sat with that. The alternative was losing everything she had built, and so she had carried it. For 30-something years, Margaret had carried the knowledge that her husband had been with someone else, and that there may have been a child, and she had chosen to believe the version that made the marriage survivable, and she had built her life on top of it, and decorated it, and defended it. And then her daughter-in-law had become pregnant, and something in Margaret, some old wound that had never fully healed, some fear that had lived underneath the chosen belief for 3 decades, had surfaced, had looked at me and my pregnancy and my daughter and had seen, not me, but the ghost of something she had been not looking at for 30 years. She had not been accusing me. She had been afraid of herself. I want to be precise about what I did with this understanding, because it would be easy to collapse it into forgiveness, and I am not interested in easy collapses. I did not forgive Margaret immediately. I am not a person who performs forgiveness as a social grace. I am a litigator, and I understand that accountability precedes absolution in any proceeding I would consider legitimate. Margaret had sent a DNA kit to my husband to suggest I had been unfaithful, She had done this while carrying a secret about her own marriage's fidelity. The irony of her position did not reduce the harm of her action. What the understanding gave me was context, not exculpation, context. The difference between those two things is significant, and I maintain it deliberately. Margaret had been afraid for 30 years. Her fear had produced a defense mechanism, a tendency to locate potential betrayal in the people around her, to be the one who exposed the infidelity before the infidelity could expose her, to be preemptively certain about other people's guilt because being certain felt safer than being uncertain about her own history. She had aimed that mechanism at me, and the mechanism had fired and turned around and revealed the thing she had been protecting. This is not a justification. This is a description of a damaged person doing damage from a place of damage, which is how most damage in families is done, and which is the thing I ask my clients to understand when the person who harmed them turns out to have been harmed first. I spoke to Margaret myself, 3 months after David's conversation with her. I called and asked if I could come alone, without David, which surprised her. I could hear it in the pause before she said yes. I drove to her house on a Saturday morning. She opened the door and she looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Not physically, but in the specific way of a person who has been carrying something very large and has recently set it down and doesn't yet know how to inhabit the space where the weight was. We sat in her living room, not the kitchen, the living room, which is more formal and which I chose deliberately because I wanted the formality. I was not there as a daughter-in-law making peace over coffee, I was there as a woman who had been accused and who had things to say. I said them. I told her what the year had cost me. Not the DNA test specifically, the whole year, the comments about the coloring and the features, and the articles about genetic inheritance. The atmosphere she had created in the family around my daughter's arrival, the way Nora had been the subject of a suspicion before she was old enough to know what suspicion was, and how that suspicion had lived in the room every time Margaret held her. Margaret listened. She did not interrupt. He looked at her hands for most of it. When I finished, she said, I was afraid. She said, I know that's not, I said. It's not an explanation. I know that too, she said. What do you need from me? I said, I need you to be her grandmother without the audit. I need you to hold my daughter without the question underneath the holding. I need you to look at Nora and see Nora. She was quiet for a long time, and she said, she has Gerald's eyes. Not David's eyes. Gerald's eyes, the grandfather. 2 generations back, confirmed now by evidence she had instead deepened. I said, yes, she does, Heber. Margaret looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face. Not warmth, exactly. Something more tentative than warmth. The expression of a woman attempting something she is not practiced at. He said, I'm sorry, Sarah. My name. Without the pause before it, I received it. Not as enough. As a beginning, Patricia Olin came to Boston in October. David arranged it, a quiet dinner, just the 3 of us, and Patricia and her daughter, in a restaurant where we could talk without occasion pressing us. I want to tell you what it was like to sit across from a woman who exists because of a choice Gerald Hendricks made 60 years ago, who grew up without the father, whose eyes my daughter inherited, who spent 30 years knowing a name and choosing not to disrupt a family she had no connection to. She is quiet and precise, and she laughs at the same things David laughs at, which is the strangest and most affecting evidence of genetic inheritance I have ever witnessed. The specific cadence of a laugh, identical across two people who did not grow up in the same house, Frayne, who shared nothing but biology and found each other at 59 and 38 through a cotton swab in a plastic tube. She said at dinner that she had not expected to feel what she felt when David's letter arrived, either. That she had spent 30 years being a complete person without this family, and had not known she was waiting for anything, until the letter came, and she realized she had been. I said, "I'm glad the kit found you." He looked at me. "Your mother-in-law ordered the kit?" I said. "She did." Patricia was quiet for a moment, then she said, "She was trying to prove something about you." I said, "Yes," she said, "and instead she found me." I said, "Yes." She looked at David. Something moved across her face that I did not try to name. She said, "I'm glad she did. My daughter Nora is 3 years old now. She has the Hendrix eyes. The gray-green that runs through 3 documented generations and 1 undocumented one. Confirmed now in a laboratory database and in the face of a woman in Connecticut who teaches her grandchildren to garden on weekends. Nora calls Margaret Grandma. She does it without ceremony, in the way children do things they have been taught to do, and which have become simply the names of things. Margaret holds her differently than she did in the first 14 months. I notice this, because I notice everything, and what I notice is the absence of the audit. The question is gone from the holding. She holds Nora the way a grandmother holds a grandchild. She is simply glad exists. This is not nothing, This is, in fact, significant. The removal of a question from a relationship is a structural change, and structural changes in families are rare and slow and worth acknowledging when they occur. I acknowledge it. I do not perform gratitude for it. Because performing gratitude for a baseline that should have been the baseline from the beginning is a thing I will not do. But I acknowledge it, because accuracy requires that I acknowledge what has changed and not only what was wrong. Here is what I know about being accused of something by someone who is carrying the same thing. It is almost never about you. The accusation that arrives with the most ferocity, the most organized, the most sustained, the most resourced with research and planning and padded envelopes, is almost always the accusation of a person who is afraid of something in themselves and has located a target for that fear. The target is often the person who represents, in some way, the thing they are afraid of. The new wife, the arriving child, the evidence of a future that might expose a past. You are not the point of the accusation. You are the available surface. This does not make the accusation harmless. It does not make the padded envelope, or the note, or the year of comments, or the DNA kit, or the quiet audit of your daughter's features forgivable without process. Damage done from fear is still damage, and the person who receives it deserves to name it and respond to it and require accountability for it, equally. But understanding the source, locating the fear underneath the attack, changes what you are dealing with. It does not change what was done. It changes what you are fighting, and knowing what you are fighting is the first requirement of fighting it well. I am a litigator. I know that the case that appears to be about one thing is often underneath, about something else entirely. The most important question in any proceeding is not what is being claimed. It is what is being protected. Margaret was protecting a marriage she had chosen to believe in. She had been protecting it for 30 years. And the protection had curdled into suspicion, and the suspicion had found a target, and the target had taken the test, and the test had found the thing she had been protecting against. The test found the truth. It always does. I am 39 years old. I have a daughter with gray-green eyes and a husband who is a cardiologist and a sister-in-law in Connecticut who gardens with her grandchildren on weekends and who texts David photographs of her tomato plants in a way that makes him laugh, the specific laugh they share. I have a mother-in-law who says my name without pausing before it now. Not always. Sometimes the old habit returns, the pause, the management, the slight withdrawal. When it does, yeah. I notice it, and I don't name it, and I wait for it to pass. Because I have learned that some patterns take longer to change than one conversation, no matter how necessary the conversation was. E. I have a filing cabinet with documentation in it. I am a litigator. I keep the record, and I have a daughter who will grow up, knowing that when someone questioned who she was, we answered them, Katie. That we did not refuse the question, or hide from it, or send it back unopened. That we sat with the cotton swab and the waiting, and we answered, completely and on the record, Geetha. Because the truth was never something we needed to be afraid of. That is the thing I most want her to know. The truth was never something we needed to be afraid of. Hebe. It is the people who have something to protect from the truth who order the kits, and the truth has a way of finding them anyway. Shastuder, if this story found you, Gita. Share it with someone who has been the target of an accusation from someone who was afraid of themselves. Leave a comment. I read everyone. Ye. And, if you have ever been handed an envelope designed to prove something about you, and opened it anyway, because you had nothing to hide, you already knew what the results would say. The surprise was always going to be theirs.